Before you judge me, I hope you understand the context of this story. My name is Esperanza Morales, and I am 73 years old. I live in a modest duplex in East Los Angeles, California, where the late autumn sun was casting long shadows across my small garden when my world came crashing down around me. The November air carried the familiar scent of burning leaves and the distant sound of children playing in Hollenbeck Park, but inside my living room, all I could hear was the echo of the most hurtful words anyone had ever spoken to me. "You're worthless, Esperanza. You contribute nothing to this family, and we're tired of carrying your dead weight." The words had come from Miguel, my son-in-law of 8 years, delivered with a venom that still made my hands shake hours later. "We don't owe you anything, and it's time you understood that." I sat in my favorite armchair, the same chair where I had rocked Miguel to sleep countless times when he was a baby, and tried to understand how we had reached this point. The man who had just screamed at me with such hatred was the same little boy I had raised from the age of 2. After his teenage mother, my daughter Rosa, had been killed in a car accident 26 years ago. Miguel had been just a toddler, then barely walking, speaking only a handful of words when social services had placed him in my care permanently. His father had never been in the picture, and Rosa's death had left him completely alone in the world, except for me. I had been 47 years old, working as a seamstress in a downtown factory, barely making ends meet in my one-bedroom apartment. But when they brought that frightened little boy to my door, there had never been any question about what I would do. I had transformed my sewing room into a bedroom for Miguel, had learned to stretch my already tight budget to include diapers, baby food, and eventually school supplies and clothes for a growing boy. I had walked him to his first day of kindergarten, had helped him with homework every night at my kitchen table, had attended every parent-teacher conference and school, play throughout his childhood. When other mothers complained about the challenges of raising children, I had smiled and kept my struggles to myself, because Miguel wasn't just my grandson, he was my whole world. The irony of today's confrontation was that it had started over money, specifically the property taxes on the duplex that Miguel and my daughter-in-law Carmen now owned. 3 years ago, when Miguel had graduated from college and gotten his job at the engineering firm, he had convinced me to sign over the deed to my home to help him build equity and secure the family's future. I had trusted him completely, had believed his promises that I would always have a place to live, that he was just trying to protect me from financial worries in my old age. "Mama Esperanza, you don't understand how property taxes work," Miguel had explained with the patient tone of someone speaking to a child. "If you transfer the house to us, we can take advantage of tax breaks that will save the family thousands of dollars. And of course, you'll always live here. This is your home." Carmen had nodded enthusiastically, adding, "We just want to make sure you're taken care of, Mama. This way, if something happens to you, there won't be any legal complications. Everything will be smooth and simple." I had signed the papers because I trusted them, because Miguel was the son I had raised, because I believed that family took care of family. The lawyer had explained the documents to me, had made sure I understood that I was transferring full ownership of the property, but Miguel had assured me it was just a formality. "Nothing will change, Mama," he had promised. "This is still your house, but everything had changed. Gradually, subtly at first, then with increasing boldness, Miguel and Carmen had begun treating me like a tenant in my own home. They had started making decisions about repairs and modifications without consulting me. They had complained about the cost of maintaining the property, had suggested that maybe I should contribute more to household expenses, when I had reminded them that I was living on a fixed Social Security income. They had exchanged looks that spoke of conversations I wasn't privy to. The final straw had come this morning when Miguel had arrived with a stack of bills and an expression I had never seen before, cold, calculating, completely devoid of the warmth that had characterized our relationship for over 20 years. "Esperanza, we need to talk about your living situation," he had said, not even bothering with the mama that he had called me since childhood. The property taxes have gone up again, and frankly, Carmen and I are struggling to make ends meet. With all these expenses. What are you saying, mijo? I had asked, though something in his tone had already made my stomach clench with dread. I'm saying that if you want to continue living here, you need to start paying rent, market rate rent. We've looked into it, and a place like this rents for at least $1,500 a month. The number had hit me like a physical blow. My entire Social Security check was barely $1,100 a month. After paying for my medications, groceries, and other basic necessities, I had maybe $200 left over each month. Miguel, you know I can't afford that. Where would I get that kind of money? That's not our problem, Carmen had interjected, speaking from the doorway where she had been listening. We have our own family to think about now. We have 2 children to support, a mortgage on this property, and frankly, we've been subsidizing your lifestyle for too long. Subsidizing my lifestyle? I had repeated in disbelief. This is my home. I lived here for 30 years before you were even born, Carmen. Actually, it's our home now, Miguel had corrected with a lawyer-like precision that had chilled me to the bone. You signed it over to us, remember? Legally, you're just a guest here, and guests who don't contribute need to find other arrangements. That's when I had made the mistake of reminding Miguel of everything I had done for him. I had talked about the years of sacrifice, the love, the dedication. I had mentioned how I had given up my own dreams to raise him, how I had worked double, shifts to pay for his college, how I had been both mother and father to him for over 2 decades. And that's when Miguel had exploded with a rage I had never seen before. I'm sick of hearing about everything you supposedly did for me. You didn't do me any favors, you did what you were supposed to do, and now you act like I owe you something for the rest of my life. I never said you owed me anything, I had protested, tears streaming down my face. I just don't understand how you can throw me out of my own home. It's not your home, Miguel had shouted. And you know what? You're right that I don't owe you anything. You're worthless, Esperanza. You contribute nothing to this family, and we're tired of carrying your dead weight. Find somewhere else to live, because we're done supporting you. The words had hit me with such force that I had actually staggered backward. Worthless, dead weight. These words, coming from the mouth of the little boy I had loved more than my own life, had shattered something inside me that I wasn't sure could ever be repaired. After Miguel and Carmen had left, presumably to give me time to process their ultimatum, I had sat in my chair for hours, trying to understand how we had reached this point. I thought about all the times I had gone without so that Miguel could have what he needed. The winter when I had worn the same old coat for months, so I could buy him new school clothes. The summer when I had worked 16-hour days to save money for his senior class trip. The countless evenings when I had helped him with homework instead of resting my aching back after long days at the factory. I thought about his high school graduation, when he had hugged me on stage and whispered, "Thank you for everything, Mama. I love you so much." I thought about his college graduation, when he had introduced me to his professors as the woman who made all this possible. I thought about his wedding day, when he had asked me to walk him down the aisle because, "You're the only parent I've ever really had." How had that grateful, loving young man become someone who could look me in the eye and call me worthless? As the afternoon faded into evening, I began to understand that this wasn't really about money or property taxes. This was about Miguel, wanting to start fresh with his new family without the constant reminder of his humble beginnings. He had achieved success, a good job, a beautiful wife, 2 healthy children, and apparently having his old grandmother around was cramping his style. The duplex had appreciated significantly in value over the past 3 years. What had been worth maybe $200,000 when I had signed it over was now worth close to $400,000. Miguel and Carmen weren't struggling financially. They were positioning themselves to cash in on their windfall, and my presence was an inconvenience they no longer wanted to tolerate. That night, As I lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of the neighborhood where I had lived for 3 decades, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to quietly disappear to make Miguel's life easier. I wasn't going to accept being discarded like an old piece of furniture that no longer matched the decor. If Miguel wanted to treat this as a legal matter rather than a family matter, then I would respond accordingly. I would fight for my rights, for my home, and for the respect that The next morning, I woke up with a clarity of purpose I hadn't felt in years. After a sleepless night of anger, hurt, and determination, I had made peace with what I needed to do. At 7:30 sharp, I was sitting in the cramped waiting room of Legal Aid of Los Angeles, one of the first clients of the day. The young lawyer assigned to my case, Patricia Ruiz, looked barely old enough to be out of law school, but her eyes were sharp and compassionate as I told her my story. She listened without interrupting, occasionally taking notes, her expression growing more serious as I detailed Miguel's transformation from grateful son to hostile property owner. "Mrs. Morales, let me make sure I understand this correctly," Patricia said when I finished. "You raised your grandson from the age of 2 after your daughter died. You supported him financially through college, then 3 years ago, he convinced you to transfer your property to him for supposed tax benefits. Now he's demanding market rate rent that he knows you can't afford, essentially trying to force you out of your own home." "That's exactly right," I confirmed. "And yesterday he told me I was worthless and that his family was tired of carrying my dead weight." Patricia shook her head in disgust. "I've seen cases like this before, unfortunately. Adult children who convince elderly parents to transfer property, then use their legal ownership to exploit or abandon them. It's a form of elder abuse, and it's both morally reprehensible and legally actionable." "What can we do?" I asked, feeling a spark of hope for the first time since yesterday's confrontation. "Several things," Patricia said, consulting her notes. "First, we're going to file for an emergency restraining order to prevent them from evicting you while we pursue other remedies. Second, we're going to examine the circumstances under which you transferred the property. If there was any fraud, undue influence, or misrepresentation involved, we may be able to void the transfer entirely." She paused, looking at me seriously. "But I need to warn you, Mrs. Morales, this is going to be emotionally difficult. Your grandson and his wife are going to fight this hard, and they're going to say things about you and your motivations that will be painful to hear. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about Miguel's words from yesterday, about the contempt in his voice when he called me worthless. He's already said the worst things he could say to me. I'm not afraid of the truth coming out. Over the next 2 weeks, Patricia and I worked together to build our case. She requested copies of all the documents related to the property transfer, interviewed neighbors who could testify about my long residence in the duplex, and gathered financial records showing the sacrifices I had made for Miguel's education and upbringing. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank records showed that I had liquidated my entire retirement savings to pay for Miguel's college tuition. My employment records documented years of overtime work to support him. School records confirmed that I had been listed as his primary guardian and emergency contact throughout his childhood and adolescence. Most importantly, Patricia had uncovered evidence that Miguel and Carmen had been planning to sell the property all along. Their mortgage application, filed just 6 months after I had transferred the deed, included projections for the home's future value and references to it as an investment property. "They never intended for you to live there permanently," Patricia explained as we reviewed the documents. "This was always about getting control of a valuable asset. The timing of their demands coincides perfectly with the property reaching peak market value." Meanwhile, Miguel and Carmen had hired their own lawyer, an expensive downtown attorney who specialized in real estate law. They were claiming that the property transfer had been a legitimate gift, that I had been living rent-free for 3 years as a courtesy, and that their request for market-rate rent was entirely reasonable. But they had made a crucial mistake. In their legal response, they had claimed that they owed me nothing because they had already provided adequate compensation through free housing. This directly contradicted Miguel's promises at the time of the transfer that nothing would change, that the house would always be my home. The hearing was scheduled for a Friday morning in November, exactly 3 weeks after Miguel had called me worthless. As Patricia and I walked up the steps of the courthouse, I felt a mixture of nervousness and determination. This wasn't just about money or property anymore. It was about whether 26 years of devoted parenting meant anything at all. Miguel and Carmen were already seated at the defendant's table with their lawyer, an older man in an expensive suit who looked like he charged more per hour than I received in a month. Miguel avoided making eye contact with me, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he kept fidgeting with his pen. Judge Maria Santos was a woman in her 60s with graying hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She had a reputation for being fair but no nonsense, particularly in cases involving family disputes. This is a case about property rights, elder care, and family obligations, Judge Santos began, reading from the case summary. Mrs. Morales is seeking to void a property transfer and alleging elder abuse. The defendants claim they are the rightful owners seeking reasonable rent from a tenant. Let's start with the plaintiff's case. Patricia stood and began presenting our evidence methodically. She showed the timeline of the property transfer, demonstrated my financial contributions to Miguel's upbringing, and played a recording I had made of Miguel's verbal abuse from that terrible day. When Miguel's voice filled the courtroom calling, "Me worthless and dead weight," I saw Judge Santos's expression harden. "Mrs. Morales," Patricia said, "can you tell the court about your relationship with the defendant, Miguel Morales?" I took a deep breath and began telling the story I had never spoken aloud in its entirety. I talked about Rosa's death, about taking in a frightened 2-year-old, about the years of struggle and sacrifice. I described working double shifts to pay for his school clothes, selling my jewelry to cover his college application fees, giving up my own dreams so he could pursue his. "Did Miguel ever express gratitude for your sacrifices?" Patricia asked. "For years, yes," I said, my voice steady despite the emotion. "He called me Mama, introduced me as his parent at school events, thanked me constantly, even at his wedding. He told me I was the only real parent he had ever known." "And when did that change?" "When he didn't need me anymore," I said simply. "When he had achieved success and decided that having an old grandmother around was embarrassing or inconvenient." Miguel's lawyer, Mr. Richardson, stood for cross-examination. He was skilled, I had to admit, but his questions revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what this case was really about. "Mrs. Morales, isn't it true that you voluntarily transferred the property to my clients 3 years ago?" "Yes, but under false pretenses," I replied. "Miguel told me it was just for tax purposes, that nothing would change." "Isn't it also true that you've been living rent-free in a valuable property for 3 years?" "I've been living in my own home, which I owned, for 30 years before Miguel was even born. But legally you no longer own that home, do you?" "Legally, no, but morally, yes. I built my life there, and I was promised I would always have a place there." Mr. Richardson continued his questions, trying to portray me as a vindictive old woman, trying to manipulate her successful grandson. But every question he asked gave me an opportunity to highlight Miguel's ingratitude and betrayal. Then it was Miguel's turn to testify, and I watched the boy I had raised walk to the witness stand with the confidence of someone who believed he was completely in the right. "Mr. Morales," his lawyer began, "can you explain the circumstances of the property transfer?" "My grandmother was getting older, and we were concerned about her ability to manage the property," Miguel said smoothly. "We thought it would be better if younger family members took over those responsibilities." "And you allowed her to continue living there rent-free for 3 years?" "Yes, as a courtesy. But our financial situation has changed, and we can no longer afford to subsidize her housing. It was a carefully crafted narrative designed to make Miguel sound responsible and generous rather than calculating and cruel. But then Patricia stood for cross-examination, and I knew Miguel was about to face questions he wasn't prepared for. Mr. Morales, you testified that Mrs. Morales is your grandmother. Is that accurate? Yes, Miguel said, looking confused by the question. Actually, isn't it true that Mrs. Morales is your step-grandmother, and that she became your legal guardian? When your mother died? Miguel's lawyer objected, but Judge Santos overruled him. Answer the question, Mr. Morales. Yes, she became my guardian when my mother died. How old were you when that happened? 2 years old. So Mrs. Morales raised you from the age of 2. Would it be fair to say she was more of a mother to you than a grandmother? Miguel shifted uncomfortably. She took care of me, yes. More than took care of you. She sacrificed her own financial security to put you through college, didn't she? She helped with college expenses. She liquidated her entire retirement savings, over $40,000, to pay your tuition. Isn't that correct? Miguel's confident demeanor was starting to crack. She wanted to help. And in return for 24 years of parenting and financial sacrifice, you're now charging her rent that you know she can't afford, essentially forcing her out of the only home she's ever known? We have our own family to think about now. That's when Judge Santos leaned forward, and I could see she had heard enough. Mr. Morales, let me ask you a question directly. The woman sitting at that table over there, she raised you from the time you were 2 years old, correct? Yes, Your Honor. She worked extra shifts to pay for your clothes, your school supplies, your college education. Yes, Your Honor. She attended your school events, helped with homework, was essentially your mother for over 20 years. Miguel's voice was barely audible. Yes, Your Honor. Judge Santos leaned back in her chair, and when she spoke, her voice carried a weight that made the entire courtroom fall silent. Then explain to me, Mr. Morales, how you justify calling the woman who raised you worthless and dead weight. Explain to me how you can look at your mother, because that's what she is, regardless of genetics, and tell her she contributes nothing to your family. The question hung in the air like an accusation, and I watched Miguel's face as the full reality of his actions finally hit him. For the first time in months, I saw a glimpse of the little boy I had raised, the child who had once hugged me and promised to always love me. But it was too late for regret. The damage had been done, and now a courtroom full of strangers had heard exactly what kind of man my sacrifices had produced. The silence in the courtroom stretched on as Miguel sat frozen in the witness chair, unable to answer Judge Santos's devastating question. I watched the man I had raised struggle with the weight of his own words, his confident facade crumbling, as the reality of what he had done became impossible to deny. I didn't mean, Miguel started, then stopped, realizing that any explanation would only make things worse. Judge Santos wasn't finished. Mr. Morales, I've been presiding over family court cases for over 15 years, and I've seen every kind of family dysfunction imaginable. But I have never encountered a case where someone who was raised with such love and sacrifice could turn so completely against the person who gave them everything. Miguel's lawyer tried to object, claiming the judge was being prejudicial, but Judge Santos silenced him with a look. Mr. Richardson, your client opened this door when he decided to characterize his relationship with Mrs. Morales as simply landlord and tenant. The court has a right to understand the full context of that relationship. She turned back to Miguel, who was now visibly shaking. Let me ask you another question, Mr. Morales. When you signed those mortgage documents 6 months after obtaining this property, did you disclose to the bank that Mrs. Morales was living there as a family member who had transferred the property to you? Miguel's eyes darted to his lawyer, who was frantically shuffling through papers. I'm not sure what the bank required. Actually, let me help refresh your memory, Patricia interjected, standing with a document in her hand. Your Honor, I'd like to introduce Exhibit F, Mr. Morales' mortgage application, in which he explicitly listed the property as investment real estate with rental income potential. The document was passed to Judge Santos, who read it with growing displeasure. "So you committed mortgage fraud as well, Mr. Morales. You obtained a loan under false pretenses while planning all along to either charge your guardian rent or force her out entirely." "Your Honor, my client was simply exploring his options," Mr. Richardson began. "Your client was committing elder abuse," Judge Santos cut him off. "And the evidence suggests this was premeditated from the moment he convinced Mrs. Morales to transfer the property." She looked back at Miguel, and I could see her trying to understand how someone could be so cruel to the person who had sacrificed everything for them. "Mr. Morales, I'm going to give you one more opportunity to explain yourself. You have heard the testimony about Mrs. Morales's sacrifices for you. You've acknowledged that she raised you, supported you financially, and treated you as her own son. So I ask you again, how do you justify your treatment of her?" Miguel was crying now, tears streaming down his face as 26 years of love and ingratitude played out in his memory. When he spoke, his voice was broken and barely audible. "I don't know. I don't know how to justify it." "You don't know," Judge Santos repeated. "You called the woman who raised you worthless, but you don't know why?" "I was angry," Miguel whispered. I felt like she was holding me back, reminding me of where I came from. I wanted to start fresh with my new family, and having her around made that difficult." The honesty of his answer was somehow worse than his earlier denials. He had deliberately chosen to hurt me, to push me away, because I was an inconvenient reminder of his humble origins. "So, you decided to steal her home and abandon her because she embarrassed you?" Judge Santos asked, her voice incredulous. "I didn't think of it as stealing," Miguel said. "I thought of it as moving on. Moving on by leaving behind the person who made your success possible in the first place." Miguel had no answer for that. The truth was laid bare now. He had used me, taken everything I had to offer, and then discarded me when I was no longer useful to his image of himself. Judge Santos called for a recess, and Patricia and I went to the hallway to wait for the proceedings to resume. I felt emotionally drained but also strangely relieved. For years, I had wondered if I was being too sensitive about Miguel's growing coldness toward me. Now I knew that my instincts had been correct. The man I had raised had indeed forgotten every lesson about loyalty, gratitude, and family that I had tried to teach him. "How do you feel?" Patricia asked as we sat on a bench outside the courtroom. "Sad," I said honestly, but not surprised. I think I knew he had changed completely, but I kept hoping I was wrong. When court resumed, Judge Santos delivered her ruling with a firmness that left no room for appeal. The court finds that the property transfer was obtained through fraud and undue influence. Mr. Morales misrepresented his intentions and took advantage of Mrs. Morales's trust to obtain valuable property under false pretenses. She continued, "Furthermore, the court finds clear evidence of elder abuse in Mr. Morales's treatment of Mrs. Morales. His attempts to charge her unaffordable rent while knowing she had no other housing options constitute financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult." Miguel and Carmen sat in stunned silence as Judge Santos outlined her orders. "The property transfer is hereby voided, and full ownership is restored to Mrs. Morales. Mr. Morales and his family have 30 days to vacate the premises they have been occupying. Additionally, Mr. Morales will pay restitution to Mrs. Morales in the amount of $50,000 to compensate for the appreciation in property value that he improperly attempted to claim." But Judge Santos wasn't finished. "Mr. Morales, I want you to understand something. Mrs. Morales didn't bring this case because she wanted to hurt you. She brought it because you left her no choice. You forced a 73-year-old woman who raised you from infancy to fight for the right to live in her own home. That is a level of cruelty that this court finds deeply disturbing." She looked directly at Miguel, who was now sobbing openly. "You had a woman who loved you unconditionally, who sacrificed everything for your success, who would have given you anything you asked for. All she wanted in return was to be treated with basic human decency, and you couldn't even give her that. Your honor, Miguel managed to say through his tears. I want to apologize. I want to make this right. Apologize to Mrs. Morales, not to me, Judge Santos said firmly, and understand that making this right will take more than words. You've broken something that may never be repaired. As we left the courthouse that afternoon, I felt a mixture of victory and profound sadness. I had won my case, had regained my home, had been vindicated in the eyes of the law. But the cost had been enormous, the destruction of the most important relationship in my life. Miguel tried to approach me as we walked down the courthouse steps, but I wasn't ready to face him yet. The wounds were too fresh, the betrayal too complete. Patricia guided me to her car while Miguel stood on the sidewalk, watching us leave with the broken expression of someone who had finally understood what they had lost. That evening, as I sat in my living room, legally and rightfully mine once again, I thought about the little boy who had once crawled into my lap during thunderstorms, who had called me Mama and meant it with all his heart. That boy was gone, replaced by a man who had forgotten every lesson about love and loyalty I had tried to teach him. But I also thought about Judge Santos's words, about Miguel's breakdown on the witness stand, about the tears he had shed when confronted with the truth of his actions. Perhaps there was still hope for redemption, still a chance for him to remember who he used to be and who he could be again. The question was whether either of us would live long enough to find out. 6 months after the court ruling, I was tending to my small garden when I heard the familiar sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Looking up, I saw Miguel getting out of his vehicle, moving slowly and uncertainly toward my front door. He looked older somehow, as if the weight of his actions had aged him years in just a few months. This was the first time he had attempted to visit since the trial. In the immediate aftermath of Judge Santos's ruling, Miguel and Carmen had moved out quietly, taking their belongings and leaving without a word. I had heard through neighbors that they had rented a small apartment across town, struggling financially after having to pay the court-ordered restitution and losing what they had seen as their primary asset. Mama Esperanza, Miguel said softly, when I answered the door. The return to his childhood name for me caught me off guard. Could we talk? Please? I looked at this man I had raised, seeing the genuine remorse in his eyes, but also remembering the cruel words he had spoken 6 months earlier. What do you want to talk about, Miguel? About how wrong I was, he said simply. About how sorry I am, about whether there's any way to repair what I've broken. I invited him in, and we sat in my living room where so many important conversations had taken place over the years. Miguel looked around at the familiar surroundings, the family photos on the mantel, the furniture he had grown up with, the atmosphere of love and warmth he had tried so hard to leave behind. The past 6 months have been the worst of my life, Miguel began, his voice heavy with regret. Not because of the money or losing the house, but because I finally understood what I had done to you, what I had become. I waited for him to continue, not ready to make this conversation easy for him. Carmen left me, he said quietly. She said she couldn't stay married to someone who could treat his own mother the way I treated you. She took the kids and moved back with her parents. She said she was afraid of what kind of father I might become if I could be so cruel to the woman who raised me. The news surprised me, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Carmen had always seemed uncomfortable with Miguel's treatment of me, but I hadn't realized how deeply it had affected her view of him as a person. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, and I meant it. Despite everything, I didn't want Miguel to suffer needlessly. Are you? Miguel asked, looking at me with surprise. After everything I put you through, you're sorry that my marriage fell apart? I'm sorry because I love you, I said simply. I've always loved you, even when you were breaking my heart. Loving someone doesn't stop just because they hurt you, Miguel broke down then. sobbing with the raw emotion of someone who had finally allowed themselves to feel the full weight of their actions. I don't deserve your love. I don't deserve your forgiveness. I called you worthless when you're the most valuable person in my life. I tried to steal your home when you gave me everything you had. Miguel, I said gently, why did you change so much? What happened to the grateful, loving boy I raised? He wiped his eyes and took a shaky breath. I think I was ashamed. When I started making good money, when I married Carmen and met her educated family, I became embarrassed about where I came from, about being raised by a seamstress in East LA, about speaking Spanish at home, about having a grandmother who worked with her hands instead of sitting in an office. The honesty was painful, but necessary. So, you decided to cut me out of your life. I thought if I could distance myself from my past, from you, I could become someone completely different, someone who belonged in Carmen's world. He looked at me with eyes full of regret. But I didn't realize that cutting you out meant cutting out the best part of myself, the part that knew how to love, how to be grateful, how to treat people with kindness. We talked for hours that afternoon, with Miguel telling me about the months of self-reflection that had followed the trial. He had started seeing a therapist, had begun to understand how his feelings of shame about his background had morphed into resentment toward me. He had also begun to appreciate, perhaps for the first time as an adult, the magnitude of the sacrifices I had made for him. I looked at my old report cards the other day, Miguel said. Every single one has your signature on it, never missing a parent-teacher conference. I remembered how you used to help me with homework every night, even after working 10-hour shifts. I thought about how you never missed a school play or baseball game, even when you were exhausted. He paused, his voice thick with emotion. And I remembered how proud you were at my graduation, how you cried when I got my first job. You were so excited about my success, and I repaid you by being ashamed of you. What do you want from me now? Miguel, I asked, what are you hoping will happen? I want to earn back your trust, he said. I want to become the man you raised me to be, instead of the selfish person I became. I want my children to know their abuela, to learn from you the way I did, and someday, if you can find it in your heart, I want your forgiveness. I looked at this broken man sitting in my living room, and I saw both the cruel person who had tried to steal my home and the little boy who had once promised to always love me. Miguel, forgiveness isn't something you earn. It's something you receive as a gift, and I've already forgiven you. You have? He asked in amazement. The moment you walked in here and called me Mama again, I forgave you. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean going back to the way things were. If we're going to rebuild our relationship, it has to be on different terms. Miguel nodded eagerly. Whatever terms you want, I'll do anything.